What would you do if your husband invited his mistress to dinner at a five-star restaurant while you were 7 months pregnant? One woman answered that question in the most spectacular way possible, and it was all caught on camera. But the viral video everyone saw, that was only 5% of the story. What happened over the next 18 months involved federal crimes, $300 million, in a courtroom showdown that made headlines worldwide. Before we dive in, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a like if you believe in karma. Comment below what you'd do in her situation. Because this story proves that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting everything. Here's what really happened. Security camera footage would later show the exact moment Claire Hartley's world split in two. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late September. The location was Bloomin' Barrel, Chicago's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, where reservations required a 3-month wait and tables cost more than most people's monthly rent. But that footage wouldn't surface until much later, after everything had already burned to the ground. 6 months before that night, Claire stood in the marble bathroom of her penthouse, staring at two pink lines on a pregnancy test. Her hands shook as she set it on the counter beside the sink. Through the open door, she could see her reflection in the bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline glittering behind her like a promise. She was 34 years old. She'd been married to Michael Hartley for 7 years, and for the first time in months, she felt something like hope. "Michael," she called out, walking into their bedroom. "Are you home?" The penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. She checked her phone. A text from him sent 2 hours ago. "Late meeting with investors. Don't wait up." Claire smiled to herself. She'd wait up. This was news that couldn't wait until morning. She spent the next hour preparing. She ordered dinner from Michael's favorite steakhouse. She bought a tiny pair of baby shoes from the boutique downstairs. She wrapped them in silver paper and placed them beside his plate at the dining table. By 11 p.m., the food had gone cold. By midnight, she'd fallen asleep on the couch, still wearing her dress. She woke at 2:15 a.m. to the sound of the front door closing. Michael walked in, loosening his tie, his dark hair slightly disheveled. He was 38 and handsome in the way that money makes men handsome. Everything about him was expensive, from his Italian suits to his practiced smile. "You're awake," he said, barely glancing at her. "You shouldn't have waited up." "I wanted to," Claire said, sitting up, her heart hammered in her chest. "I have something to tell you." He paused, finally looking at her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Annoyance, guilt. It vanished before she could name it. "Can it wait until morning? I'm exhausted." "Michael, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. She watched his face carefully, searching for joy, for surprise, for anything real. What she got was a smile, a wide, perfect smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's wonderful," he said, crossing the room to kiss her forehead. "Really wonderful. Claire, we'll celebrate properly tomorrow. I promise." He disappeared into the bedroom before she could respond. Claire sat alone in the dark living room, the wrapped baby shoes still sitting on the dining table, and felt the first whisper of something she couldn't yet name. Something that felt like dread. Over the next few months, Michael played the role of excited father-to-be with the same precision he brought to closing business deals. He attended doctor appointments when his schedule allowed. He nodded approvingly at paint samples for the nursery. He told their friends the news with just the right amount of pride. But his phone was always face down. His late-night meetings multiplied. And when Claire reached for him in bed, he was usually already asleep or pretending to be. Claire threw herself into her work at the Morrison Gallery, where she'd been the lead curator for 5 years. Her new exhibition featuring emerging Chicago artists was her most ambitious project yet. It consumed her days and gave her somewhere to put all the feelings she couldn't name. Her best friend Natalie noticed first. "You look exhausted," Natalie said one afternoon as they had coffee near the gallery. "And not just pregnancy tired. What's going on?" "Nothing," Claire said automatically. "Everything's fine." "Claire, really, I'm just stressed about the exhibition and hormonal. You know how it is." Natalie studied her with the kind of look that comes from 20 years of friendship. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" But Claire couldn't tell her what she didn't want to admit to herself, that her husband felt like a stranger, that their marriage had become a performance, that she was about to bring a child into a home that felt more like a hotel. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. Claire was 7 months pregnant, and her doctor had expressed concern about her elevated blood pressure. She was supposed to be reducing stress. Instead, she was folding Michael's laundry when she found it. A hotel receipt tucked in the pocket of his jacket. The Peninsula Hotel. A suite, charged to his personal credit card, not the business account. And on the collar of the same jacket, a smudge of lipstick in a shade she'd never worn. Claire sat on the edge of their bed, holding the receipt with hands that had gone numb. Part of her wanted to explain it away. A business meeting that ran late, a colleague who got too close while talking, innocent explanations that dissolved the moment she really looked at them. She hired a private investigator the next day. His name was Frank Morrison, no relation to the gallery. He was in his 50s, with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact manner that made the whole sordid business feel almost clinical. "I'll need 3 weeks," he said in his small office that smelled like coffee and old paper. "Maybe less if he's not being careful." "He's not being careful," Claire said quietly. "He thinks I'm too naive to notice." Frank studied her. "Mrs. Hartley, are you sure you want to know? Once I find something, you can't unknow it." Claire placed both hands on her swollen belly, feeling her daughter kick. "I'm sure." 2 weeks later, Frank handed her a manila envelope across the same desk. She didn't open it there. She took it home, waited until Michael left for work, and then spread the contents across their dining table. Photographs, dozens of them. Michael and a woman with long blonde hair and a model's figure, entering hotels, leaving restaurants, his hand on her lower back, her head thrown back in laughter. There were receipts, too. Jewelry, clothing, weekend trips to New York and Miami, and there were printed Instagram posts from an account belonging to Brooke Sterling, carefully curated glimpses of luxury, designer bags, first-class plane tickets, champagne glasses against sunset backgrounds, captions that hinted at a mysterious benefactor without ever naming him. Claire sat at that table for 3 hours, organizing the evidence into neat piles. She didn't cry. She was surprised by that. Instead, she felt something cold and clear settling into her bones. She was 7 months pregnant. Her career-defining exhibition opened in 6 weeks. Her entire life had been built around this man and his world, and every single bit of it was a lie. That night, when Michael came home, Claire made dinner like always. She asked about his day like always. She kissed him goodnight like always. But inside, she was already planning. The reservation at Betrayal was under Michael's name for 8 p.m. on Thursday. Claire knew because she'd been tracking his location through their shared phone app, a feature he'd insisted on years ago for security reasons. The irony wasn't lost on her home. She'd spent the day at the gallery, putting final touches on wall placements for the exhibition. Her assistant kept asking if she was feeling okay. Claire assured her she was fine, even though her blood pressure monitor had been beeping warnings all afternoon. At 7:30, she left the gallery and took an Uber to the restaurant. She wore a simple navy blue dress that accommodated her pregnant belly, her dark hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She wanted to look put together, but not like she was trying too hard. The Uber driver tried to make small talk. Claire stared out the window at the city lights and didn't respond. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together in her lap. "You okay, miss?" the driver asked as they pulled up to the restaurant. "I'm about to be," Claire said. Bloom and Barrel occupied the top floor of a glass tower in the Loop. The elevator ride up felt endless. Claire watched the numbers climb and tried to remember how to breathe. By the time the doors opened, her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The maitre d' approached with a practiced smile. "Good evening, madam. Do you have a reservation?" "I'm visiting my husband," Claire said. Something in her voice made him pause. "Your husband's name?" "Michael Hartley." The smile flickered. Mr. Hartley is already seated. If you'll follow me." They wound through the restaurant. Claire was aware of people glancing up, taking in her obvious pregnancy, her pale face, the tightness around her mouth. The maitre d' stopped at a corner table with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Michael sat with his back to her, leaning across the table toward a blonde woman in a silver dress. Brooke Sterling. Even more beautiful in person than in the photographs. They were laughing about something, champagne glasses in hand. "Mr. Hartley?" the maitre d' said carefully. "Your wife is here." Michael turned. For one perfect moment, his expression was completely unguarded. Shock, fear, guilt. Then his businessman's mask slammed into place. Claire, Hardy said, standing. What are you doing here? Claire walked to the table and sat down in the empty chair. I'm having dinner with my husband. Isn't that what wives do? Brooke's eyes went wide, but her lips curved into something like a smirk. Well, this is awkward. Is it? Claire looked at her directly for the first time, up close. She could see Brooke was younger than she'd thought, 29 at most. I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Claire, Michael's wife of 7 years, and you are Brooke. She didn't offer a last name. I've heard so much about you. I'm sure you have. Claire turned to the waiter who'd appeared at her elbow. Could I get a water? Please, still, not sparkling. Thank you. The waiter fled. Around them, Claire could feel the attention of other diners. Several people had their phones out now. She could see camera lights in her peripheral vision. Michael's jaw was tight. Claire, can we talk about this at home? I tried that. You're never home. She smiled pleasantly. So I thought I'd join you here instead. The restaurant is lovely. Brooke, have you been here before? Brooke was studying her with something like fascination. A few times. Michael brings me here often. How nice. Claire's water arrived. She took a long sip, buying time, trying to figure out what she was actually doing here. She'd had no plan beyond finding them together. Now that she was here, facing them both, she felt untethered, dangerous. You know, Brooke said, leaning back in her chair, you should really take better care of yourself. Pregnancy is hard on the body. You look exhausted. The words were delivered with perfect sweetness. The insult underneath was unmistakable. Something inside Claire snapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and cold and absolute. She picked up her water glass, stood, and poured the entire contents over Brooke's head. Brooke shrieked. Water dripped from her hair, her dress, onto the white tablecloth. Gasps erupted around them. Michael shot to his feet. Claire, have you lost your mind? No, Michelle, Claire said calmly. I found it. She turned to the table. The centerpiece, the champagne bottle, the carefully arranged plates of food. And with both hands on the edge of the table, she flipped it. Everything crashed. Glass shattered. Food splattered across the floor. Champagne soaked into the carpet. Brooke was still shrieking. Michael was shouting something Claire couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Claire stood there, breathing hard, her hands on her swollen belly. She looked at Michael, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. 7 years, she said quietly. I gave you 7 years? Then she turned and walked out. The elevator ride down felt like falling. Claire's legs shook. Her vision blurred at the edges. By the time she reached the street, she was crying. But she'd done it. She'd stopped being silent. She didn't know yet that multiple people had filmed the entire thing. That the video would be uploaded within the hour. That by morning, #PregnantWifeRevenge would be trending nationwide. All she knew was that her life as she'd known it was over. And somehow, that felt like relief. The video went viral while Claire was still in the Uber home. Well, not home. She couldn't go back to the penthouse. Instead, she directed the driver to Natalie's apartment in Wicker Park, her hands still shaking as she clutched her phone. Natalie opened the door in pajamas, took one look at Claire's face, and pulled her inside without a word. It wasn't until Claire was sitting on Natalie's couch with a mug of tea she wasn't drinking that her phone started exploding. Text messages, emails, notifications from social media accounts she barely used. All of them saying the same thing in different ways. You're famous. Natalie sat beside her, scrolling through Twitter on her laptop. Claire, this is everywhere. I mean everywhere. You're trending above the president. Claire stared at the screen. The video had been taken from multiple angles. Different diners had captured different moments. Someone had edited them together into a slick 2-minute clip complete with dramatic music. It had 3 million views already. The comments section was a war zone. Queen behavior. Hell yes, she deserves better. That man is trash. Why would she embarrass herself like this? Fake, totally staged. This is what feminism looks like. I didn't mean for this to happen, Claire whispered. I know. Natalie closed the laptop. But it did. So now what? Claire spent that night on Natalie's couch, her daughter kicking inside her, reading comments from thousands of strangers who suddenly had opinions about her life. By morning, legitimate news outlets had picked up the story. By afternoon, her phone was ringing with interview requests. One name kept appearing: Grace Winters, a divorce attorney whose firm specialized in high-asset cases. She'd represented several high-profile clients in messy divorces and had a reputation for being ruthless. Claire called her back. They met 2 days later in Grace's office in the Loop. Grace was 45, with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened while Claire explained everything: the affair, the evidence, the restaurant confrontation. When Claire finished, Grace sat back in her leather chair and smiled. "You did good," she said. "Better than you know." "I ruined his reputation," Claire said quietly. "And probably mine too." "No, you created leverage." Grace pulled out a legal pad. "Here's what's going to happen. Michael's company stock has already dropped 3%. The board will be panicking. He'll be desperate to control the narrative. That desperation makes men stupid. What do? We file for divorce immediately. We go after everything: the penthouse, the vacation homes, his stock portfolio, alimony, child support. We make him bleed." Grace leaned forward. "But more importantly, we control your story. You're not the crazy pregnant wife. You're the victim of a serial cheater who humiliated you in public. We get you on talk shows. We get you sympathy. By the time we're done, Michael Hartley will be begging to settle." For the first time since the restaurant, Claire felt something like hope. Over the next week, Grace orchestrated Claire's public rehabilitation with the precision of a military campaign. She arranged an interview with a sympathetic morning show host. She had Claire photographed leaving the gallery, looking professional and composed. She released a carefully worded statement to the press. "Mrs. Hartley is heartbroken by her husband's betrayal, but is focused on her health and her upcoming career retrospective at the Morrison Gallery. She asked for privacy during this difficult time." The exhibition opening became the most anticipated art event of the season. Not because of the art, although Claire's curation was genuinely brilliant, but because everyone wanted to see the pregnant wife who'd flipped a table on her cheating husband. The gallery was packed, cameras everywhere. Claire wore a flowing black dress and held her head high. She gave a speech about resilience and transformation that made people cry. She sold every piece in the show before the night ended. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by people who were calling her brave and strong and inspiring, Claire let herself believe she'd won. She should have known better. The accusations surfaced 3 days after the exhibition opening. A website called The Real Story posted an article with the headline, "Pregnant Wife's Revenge or Cheater's Projection." The article claimed Claire had been having an affair with one of the artists in her exhibition, a painter named David something who Claire had worked with for months. There were text messages, photographs of them having coffee, a quote from an anonymous source claiming they'd been sleeping together for over a year. Every word of it was a lie, but it didn't matter. The story spread like wildfire. Conservative outlets picked it up, gleefully pointing out the hypocrisy. Liberal outlets scrambled to verify the claims. The comment sections that had praised Claire now turned on her viciously. Claire sat in Natalie's apartment, watching her reputation disintegrate in real time, and realized she'd been played. Michael's legal team had manufactured the entire thing. The texts were doctored. The photographs were innocent interactions taken out of context. The anonymous source was paid. It was all fake. But proving that would take time they didn't have. The gallery board called an emergency meeting. Claire sat across from 5 stone-faced board members and listened while the chair explained that, due to recent controversies, they felt it was best if she took a temporary leave of absence. "This is exactly what he wants," Claire said. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "He's destroying my career because I embarrassed him. We have to think of the gallery's reputation," the chair said, not meeting her eyes. "I'm sure you understand." Claire understood perfectly. She walked out of that meeting and straight into a wall of cameras. Reporters shouting questions. Accusations disguised as inquiries. "Are the affair allegations true? Did you stage the restaurant incident? Are you using your pregnancy for sympathy?" Natalie pulled her through the crowd and into a waiting car. Claire sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, feeling nothing at all. "He's going to win," she said finally. "No," Natalie said fiercely. "He's not. We're going to fight this." But when Claire checked her phone, she found a message from Grace Winters. "We need to talk about my retainer. Given the new complications, I'll need additional funds up front." Claire looked at her bank account. Michael had already frozen their joint accounts. Her personal savings wouldn't cover Grace's fees for more than a few weeks. The woman who'd flipped a table and become a viral sensation was about to discover that revenge was expensive, and she was running out of money. Financial ruin came quietly, delivered through formal letters and automated phone calls. Claire sat in Natalie's cramped living room, 8 months pregnant now, sorting through the wreckage of her life one document at a time. The penthouse was gone. Michael had changed the locks while she was at the gallery meeting. Her belongings had been moved to a storage unit on the south side. When Claire went to collect them, she found everything she owned crammed into a 10 by 10 space that smelled like mildew and defeat. She stood in that storage unit, her back aching, her daughter kicking, and cried for the first time since the restaurant. Not pretty tears. Ugly, gasping sobs that echoed off the metal walls. Her wedding dress hung on a rack, still in its preservation bag. Photo albums from their honeymoon in Italy. The baby furniture she'd spent weeks choosing. All of it felt like evidence from someone else's life. Grace Winters dropped her as a client that same week. The call was professional but final. Without additional funds, she simply couldn't continue the representation. She recommended a few other attorneys. Claire called them all. None would take her case without substantial payment up front. The artists whose work she championed in the exhibition began distancing themselves. Emails went unreturned, calls to voicemail. The painter Michael's team had falsely linked her to actually release a statement denying any inappropriate relationship, but worded it in a way that made it sound like he was protecting his career rather than defending her honor. Claire's mother called from Arizona. "Maybe you should just apologize," she said. "This fighting isn't good for the baby. Michael might take you back if you're reasonable." "He cheated on me. Mom, men make mistakes. Your father and I worked through difficult times. Did Dad have a mistress?" A long pause. "That's different." Claire hung up before she said something she couldn't take back. The only person who stayed was Natalie, but even that became complicated when Claire overheard a phone call late one night. Natalie in the kitchen, voice low and worried. I know, but what am I supposed to do? Kick her out. She's 8 months pregnant. Her husband destroyed her. Yes, I understand it's been 3 weeks. I'll figure something out." Claire lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and understood. She was becoming a burden. Even her best friend had limits. She started looking for apartments she could afford on her own. The options were grim: studio apartments in dangerous neighborhoods, basement units with mold problems, places where she couldn't imagine bringing a newborn baby home. Then came the second wave of attacks. Someone leaked her medical records online, partial information, taken out of context, suggesting she'd been hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. It wasn't true. She'd seen a therapist twice after finding out about the affair, standard counseling that half the population had done at some point, but the headlines made her sound unstable. Inside Claire Hartley's mental health crisis, friends worried about pregnant wife's erratic behavior. The story grew with each retelling. By the end of the week, internet forums were diagnosing her with everything from bipolar disorder to borderline personality disorder. Complete strangers debated her sanity in comment sections. Claire stopped reading the comments. Then she stopped reading the news. Then she stopped checking social media entirely, but she couldn't stop the world from talking about her. Her bank account dwindled, $4,000, $3,000, $2,000. She couldn't afford the storage unit anymore. She told them to dispose of everything except the essentials, somewhere in a landfill outside Chicago. Her wedding dress and baby furniture and 7 years of memories became trash. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Claire woke on Natalie's couch to find her phone exploding with notifications. She almost didn't look. She'd learned that nothing good came from viral moments. But this was different. Michael and Brooke had announced their engagement on Instagram, professional photos of them on a beach somewhere tropical. Brooke's hand extended to show off a diamond that could probably fund Claire's legal defense. The caption read, "When you find your person, you know, grateful for second chances and new beginnings." The comments were congratulatory, supportive. as if Michael hadn't destroyed his pregnant wife's life 6 weeks earlier. As if starting over was admirable when you'd left wreckage behind. But it was the second post that actually broke something inside Claire. Brooke was pregnant too. The announcement was coy, a photo of baby shoes next to Michael's watch. Coming this fall, our little miracle. Claire did the math. If Brooke was far enough along to announce, she'd gotten pregnant around the same time Claire did. Maybe even before. Michael had been building a replacement family while Claire decorated a nursery for their daughter. She stood up from the couch too fast. Black spots danced across her vision. She barely made it to the bathroom before she threw up. When she came out, Natalie was standing there with her phone in hand. "Claire, I saw, this is going to blow over. In a few weeks, people will forget and you can rebuild." "With what?" Claire heard her voice rising and couldn't stop it. "I have $1,500 to my name, no job, no home. I'm about to have a baby and I can't afford diapers. What exactly am I rebuilding with?" Natalie reached for her, Claire stepped back. "I need to be alone." She grabbed her phone and her wallet and left the apartment. She walked for hours through neighborhoods she didn't know, her feet swelling in cheap shoes, her back screaming. She walked until she found herself in a part of the city she'd only driven through before, where buildings had bars on windows and groups of men watched her pass with calculating eyes. She ended up at a motel, the West Side Motor Lodge. $45 a night, paid in honeymoon. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and desperation. The sheets were thin and vaguely damp. The television only got 3 channels, and they were all static. Claire sat on the edge of the bed and called the suicide hotline. The counselor who answered had a gentle voice, Southern accent. She didn't ask why Claire was calling. She just listened while Claire explained that she was 8 months pregnant and living in a $45 motel room, and her husband had systematically destroyed everything she'd built, and she was so tired of fighting. "Here's what I want you to do," the counselor said after a long silence. "I want you to put your hand on your belly and feel your baby move." Claire did. Her daughter was active today, rolling and kicking. "That baby needs you," the counselor said. "Not the you that you were, the you that you're going to become. Can you hold on for her?" "I don't know." "That's okay. You don't have to know. You just have to hold on for one more day. Then one more day after that. Can you do that?" Claire looked around the motel room, at the water-stained ceiling and the peeling wallpaper and the mirror that showed her own reflection, pale and hollow-eyed. "Yes," she whispered. They talked for another hour. When Claire finally hung up, it was dark outside. She could hear sirens in the distance and voices shouting in another room, but she was still breathing. Her daughter was still moving. That would have to be enough. She lay down on the questionable bed and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would figure out the next step. Tomorrow she would find a way forward. But tonight she just needed to survive. Claire woke to pounding on the motel room door. For a confused moment she thought it was a dream. Then the pounding came again, urgent and insistent. "Claire Hartley, my name is Drew Sullivan. I'm a journalist. I need to talk to you." She sat up slowly, her body aching. The bedside clock read 6:47 a.m. Through the grimy window, dawn was just breaking over the city. "I'm not giving interviews," she called out. "This isn't about an interview. This is about bringing down your husband." Claire went still. After a long moment, she opened the door with the chain still attached. A man in his 30s stood there, wrinkled button-down shirt and 2 days of stubble, holding a messenger bag and a coffee cup. "How did you find me?" "I'm good at my job." He held up the coffee. "Can I come in? I promise this will be worth your time." Against her better judgment, Claire let him in. Drew Sullivan sat in the room's only chair while Claire perched on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around her belly. "I've been investigating Hartley Development for 8 months. Drew said, "Your husband's company has been involved in illegal land deals, bribery of city officials, and money laundering. I have documentation, I have sources. What I don't have is someone willing to testify who has inside access." "I don't have inside access anymore." "But you were married to him for 7 years. You must know something. Account numbers, property holdings, conversations you overheard." Claire thought back to countless dinner parties where Michael and his business partners discussed deals. She'd been dismissed as the decorative wife, ignored while men talked about real things. But she'd been listening. She'd always been listening. Even if I knew something, why would I help you every time I try to fight back? He destroys me more. Drew leaned forward. Because this is bigger than your divorce. Michael Hartley is a criminal. He's bribed his way through city planning committees. He's displaced low-income families to build luxury condos. He's hidden money offshore to avoid taxes. If we can prove it, he doesn't just lose his reputation. He goes to prison. The word hung in the air. Prison. Real consequences. Not just public embarrassment. If I do this and it falls apart, I have nothing left to lose. Claire said, do you understand that I'm living in a $45 motel room? I'm about to have a baby. If he comes after me again, I won't survive it. Then we make sure he can't come after you. Drew pulled a folder from his messenger bag. I'm working with Detective Rachel Monroe from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. This is a federal investigation. You'd be a protected witness. Claire took the folder. Inside were photographs of property documents, bank statements, emails, all of it pointing to a pattern of corruption that went back years. How long would this take? Months, probably. But Claire, if we do this right, Michael Hartley never bothers you again. He's too busy defending himself in federal court. She thought about the engagement announcement, about Brooke's smug smile and professional photographs, about Michael building a new life while her old one smoldered in ruins. Okay, she said, I'll help you. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything Claire could remember. Shell companies Michael had mentioned, meetings with city councilmen at their home, transactions that had seemed odd at the time but she'd dismissed. Drew recorded everything, his excitement growing as she talked. This is gold, he kept saying. This is exactly what we need. When they finally finished, Drew stood to leave. Detective Monroe will contact you within 48 hours. In the meantime, stay here, don't need to go back to your friend's place. Don't contact anyone Michael knows. Can you do that? Claire nodded. For the first time in weeks, she felt something that wasn't despair. It felt almost like power. Detective Rachel Monroe showed up the next afternoon. She was in her early 40s, with short gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that Claire found comforting. She explained the investigation carefully, showing Claire documents and asking detailed questions. We've been building this case for over a year, Rachel said. Your husband is careful, but he's not perfect. With your testimony, we can finally move forward with charges. When? Soon. We'll need you to testify before a grand jury. After that, if they indict, you'll likely need to testify at trial. Will I be safe? Rachel's expression softened slightly. We'll make sure of it. You have my word. Within a week, Michael was served with a federal subpoena. Claire watched the news coverage from her motel room, seeing him emerge from his office building, surrounded by lawyers. His face tight with rage. The media descended. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from Claire as the unstable ex-wife to Claire as the whistleblower, bringing down a corrupt businessman. News outlets that had vilified her 2 weeks earlier now called her brave. The gallery board reached out. They'd reconsidered her suspension. Perhaps she could return for the fall season. 2 of Michael's business partners were also subpoenaed. The investigation was expanding. Hartley Development's stock plummeted. The board called an emergency meeting to discuss Michael's position. Claire allowed herself to hope again. Maybe this time the victory would be real. Maybe this time she'd actually won. She should have known better. The article appeared on a Friday morning in one of Chicago's major newspapers, written by Drew Sullivan. But it wasn't the expose Claire had been expecting. The headline read, Hell hath no fury inside a scorned wife's vendetta against her ex-husband. Claire read it 3 times, her hands shaking. Drew had twisted everything. The evidence Claire had provided was presented as the desperate fabrications of an obsessed woman. Michael was portrayed as the victim of a malicious campaign. The affair was mentioned but minimized. Claire's mental health was questioned extensively. There were quotes from anonymous sources. She became fixated on destroying him after he ended the marriage. Her behavior has been increasingly erratic. This investigation is built on lies from a woman who can't accept that her marriage failed. Claire called Drew's number. It went straight to voicemail. She called Detective Monroe. Did you see the article? I did. Rachel's voice was carefully neutral. Claire, I need to tell you something. The investigation has been suspended. What, why? Political pressure. Michael Hartley has powerful friends. The evidence you provided is being questioned. Without corroboration, we can't move forward. But you said you'd been building this case for a year. I had been. And then your testimony became the centerpiece. Now that testimony is being portrayed as unreliable, the whole case falls apart. Claire sank onto the motel bed. He paid Drew off. Almost certainly. I'm sorry, Claire. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. After Rachel hung up, Claire sat in silence for a long time. Through the thin walls, she could hear a baby crying in another room. Her own daughter kicked insistently, as if to remind Claire she was still there. Claire pulled out her phone and opened social media. The article was everywhere. The comments were vicious. Crazy woman. False accusations ruin lives. She should be arrested for making false statements. The people who'd called her brave 2 days ago now called her dangerous. Natalie called. I saw the article. Claire, you need to stop. This is getting out of control. I didn't lie. I know, but it doesn't matter. You need to think about your baby now. Just let this go. But Claire couldn't let it go, because letting it go meant Michael won. It meant everything he'd done to her was justified. It meant he'd destroyed her life and gotten away with it. That night, she got a call from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Hello, Claire. Michael's voice, smooth and cold. I heard about your little investigation. That was a mistake. You paid off Drew. I paid for accurate reporting. There's a difference. He paused. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop this crusade. You're going to sign the divorce papers with the settlement I'm offering. And you're going to disappear from public life. If you do that, I'll make sure you have enough money to survive. And if I don't, then I'll make sure you have nothing. I'll tie you up in court until our daughter is in college. I'll make sure no gallery ever hires you again. I'll turn you into a cautionary tale. Do you understand? Claire's hand tightened on the phone. Perfectly. Good. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, my offer expires. He hung up. Claire sat in the dark motel room, listening to sirens and voices outside, feeling her daughter move inside her. She thought about giving up, about taking whatever settlement Michael offered and disappearing somewhere he'd never find her. It would be so easy. But then she thought about what that would teach her daughter, that men like Michael always won. That fighting back just made things worse. That survival meant surrender. She couldn't accept that. Not yet. Not while she still had one card left to play. The call came at 2 a.m. Claire had been asleep, or trying to be, when her phone lit up with an unknown number. After Michael's threat, she'd stopped answering unknown calls. But something made her pick up this time. Mrs. Hartley, my name is Thomas Hartley. I'm Michael's father. We need to talk. Claire sat up, her heart racing. She'd met Thomas exactly 3 times during her marriage. Once at the wedding, once at a Christmas dinner, and once at a charity gala. Each time, he'd been distant, polite, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. It's 2 in the morning. I know. I apologize. But what I have to say can't wait, and I can't risk Michael finding out about this call. He paused. I know what my son has done to you, and I want to help you destroy him. They met the next day in a small diner in Evanston, far from anywhere Michael's people might see them. Thomas Hartley was 72, silver-haired and dignified, with eyes that looked like Michael's but held actual warmth. He ordered coffee, neither of them touched, and got straight to the point. My son became someone I don't recognize, Thomas said. I built Hartley Development from nothing. I had principles, ethics. Michael took over 8 years ago and turned it into something corrupt. I've been documenting everything since then. He slid a flash drive across the table. This contains 7 years of evidence. Emails, financial records, recordings of meetings, everything you need to prove what he's done. Claire stared at the flash drive. Why are you doing this? Because he's my son, and I failed him. I taught him how to build an empire, but not how to be a decent man. That's on me. Thomas met her eyes. And because what he's done to you is unforgivable. You were pregnant with his child, and he tried to destroy you for embarrassing him. That's not the man I raised. If I use this, it will destroy him completely. I know. Thomas's voice was quiet. Do it anyway. Claire took the flash drive with shaking hands. He has powerful friends. Look what happened with Drew Sullivan, which is why you need someone powerful on your side. Thomas pulled out a business card. Grace Winters, the attorney you worked with before. I've already spoken to her. I'll cover her fees through a trust he doesn't know about. And there's more. He pulled out a second folder. Your marriage contract had a clause Michael never read carefully. If the marriage ends due to proven infidelity, you're entitled to 40% of all marital assets, including his shares in Hartley Development. That clause was my insurance policy. I never trusted Michael to stay faithful. Claire opened the folder, reading the legal language. It was all there to all arm, buried in page 47 of a 50-page contract. She remembered signing it, remembered the lawyer explaining it was standard. She'd never imagined she'd need it. 40% of his shares, she repeated. That would make me one of the largest shareholders. It would make you powerful enough to remove him as CEO. Thomas smiled grimly. My son thinks money is power. It's time he learned that power is power. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire and Grace rebuilt her case with meticulous precision. The evidence on Thomas's flash drive was devastating. Hartley Development had bribed city officials to get zoning changes. They'd laundered money through shell companies. They'd evicted low-income families with illegal tactics. Michael had personally signed off on all of it. Grace contacted Detective Monroe. With this new evidence, the federal investigation reopened. This time, they didn't rely on Claire's testimony alone. They had paper trails, recordings, multiple sources. It was airtight. Meanwhile, Claire prepared for the divorce trial. With Thomas's backing, she could afford the best forensic accountants in Chicago. They found money Michael had hidden, properties he'd transferred to shell companies, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. The settlement Michael had offered was insulting. $2 million and limited custody. With the marriage contract clause, Claire was entitled to over $300 million. He's going to fight this, Grace warned. He'll drag it through court for years if he can. Let him, and Claire said. She felt different now, harder, colder. The woman who'd cried in a storage unit was gone. What remained was someone who'd learned that the only way to beat men like Michael was to think like them. The federal charges came first. Michael was indicted on 8 counts of fraud, racketeering, and bribery. The news broke on a Wednesday morning. Claire watched the coverage from a new apartment Thomas had helped her lease, a modest place in Lincoln Park with a nursery already set up. Michael's arrest was captured by a dozen cameras. He was led out of Hartley Development in handcuffs, his lawyers swarming around him, his face a mask of rage. The board of directors held an emergency meeting that afternoon. By evening, Michael had been removed as CEO. His shares were frozen pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Hartley Development's stock crashed, losing 67% of its value in a single day. But Claire's biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. Brooke Sterling called her. We need to talk, Brooke said. Her voice sounded different, scared. They met in a coffee shop in Wrigleyville. Brooke looked smaller in person now, her designer clothes unable to hide the fear in her eyes. She was showing now, 4 months pregnant with Michael's child. He's doing to me what he did to you, Brooke said without preamble. The moment the charges hit, he cut me off. Took back the credit cards, the apartment, everything. His lawyers told me if I talk to the press, he'll sue me for defamation. Claire studied her. Why are you telling me this? Because I was stupid. I thought I was different, special. I thought he loved me. Brooke laughed bitterly. But I was just another possession. And now I'm a liability. What do you want from me? Brooke reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I recorded him, conversations about hiding money, bribing officials, all of it. I did it as insurance, in case he ever turned on me. She set the phone on the table. I want immunity from prosecution. Help me get that. And everything on this phone is yours. Claire thought about refusing, about letting Brooke face the same consequences she'd faced. But that would be what Michael would do. And Claire was trying very hard not to become him. I'll talk to Detective Monroe, she said finally. But Brooke, after this, stay away from me. Stay away from my daughter. We're not friends. We're just 2 women who love the same monster. Brooke nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. With Brooke's recordings, the case against Michael became overwhelming. His own mistress had documented years of criminal activity. The prosecutors filed additional charges. Michael's lawyers started making noises about a plea deal. The divorce trial was almost anticlimactic by comparison. Michael, facing decades in federal prison, agreed to settle. Claire got 60% of marital assets after the marriage clause was enforced. She got full custody of their daughter. She got the penthouse. Though she planned to sell it, she never wanted to live there again. On the day the divorce was finalized, Claire was in the hospital having contractions. Her daughter had decided to arrive 2 weeks early, perhaps sensing that all the fighting was finally over. Natalie held one hand, Thomas Hartley held the other. And when Claire's daughter was born at 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late June, she named her Hope. Because after everything, that's what Claire had left. Hope that the world could be fair. Hope that fighting back mattered. Hope that her daughter would grow up knowing her mother never surrendered. The nurse handed Claire her daughter, all 6 pounds and 8 ounces of her. And Claire looked into those dark eyes and whispered, "We made it." Outside, the city glittered in the darkness, indifferent to one woman's war. But inside that hospital room, Claire Hartley held her daughter and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. Oh, Mom. Michael's trial began on a cold morning in October. Claire sat in the gallery with Thomas beside her, Hope sleeping in a carrier against her chest. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and some of the families Michael had displaced with his illegal development projects. Michael looked diminished at the defense table. Prison time awaiting trial had hollowed him out. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame. His hair, always perfectly styled, now showed gray at the temples. When he glanced back and saw Claire's something flickered across his face. Regret. Hatred. She couldn't tell anymore. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the evidence from Thomas's flash drive. They played Brooke's recordings. They brought in city officials who'd accepted bribes and were now testifying in exchange for reduced sentences. They showed paper trails of money flowing through shell companies to offshore accounts. The defense tried to paint Michael as a businessman who'd made mistakes, who'd trusted the wrong people, who'd been led astray by aggressive partners. But the evidence was too overwhelming. Michael had signed the documents. Michael had authorized the payments. Michael's voice was on the recordings. On the third day, Drew Sullivan took the stand. Claire hadn't seen him since his betrayal, and looking at him now made her stomach turn. But Drew wasn't there as Michael's ally. He'd been subpoenaed by the prosecution. "Mr. Sullivan," the prosecutor said, "did Michael Hartley pay you to write a negative article about his ex-wife?" Drew shifted uncomfortably. "Yes." "How much?" $500,000. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Claire felt Thomas's hand squeeze hers. "And did Much Hartley tell you why he wanted this article written?" "He said he needed to discredit her testimony. He said if she looked unstable, the investigation would fall apart." "Did he use those exact words?" "Yes." The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. By the end of the second week, Michael's lawyers were in settlement talks with the prosecutors, but the prosecutors weren't interested in deals. They had him on 8 counts with overwhelming evidence. They wanted the maximum sentence. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all counts. The sentencing would be in 6 weeks, but everyone knew what was coming. Michael Hartley was looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Claire watched him being let out in handcuffs. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. She expected to feel triumph, victory, something satisfying. Instead, she felt nothing. This man had been her husband, the father of her child. She'd loved him once, in the way young women love the idea of powerful men. But that love had died so long ago she couldn't even remember what it felt like. Now he was just a stranger who tried to destroy her and failed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Claire had prepared a brief statement with Grace's help. She stood on the steps with Hope in her arms and spoke clearly into the microphones. "Justice was served today, not just for me, but for everyone Michael Hartley hurt in his pursuit of wealth and power. I hope this sends a message that no one is above the law, no matter how much money they have or how many lawyers they can afford." "Mrs. Hartley, how do you feel?" someone shouted. Claire looked down at her daughter, then back at the cameras. I feel free. The civil trial for the divorce assets was almost boring by comparison. Michael, facing decades in prison, had no leverage. His lawyers tried to negotiate, but Grace was relentless. Claire was awarded $340 million in total assets. The penthouse, the vacation homes, most of Michael's stock portfolio. Hartley Development itself was dissolved. The board voted to liquidate assets and pay settlements to the families Michael had displaced. Thomas worked with city officials to ensure the money went where it needed to go. Claire kept enough to ensure she and Hope would be comfortable. The rest she put into a foundation for women leaving abusive marriages. Women who needed lawyers they couldn't afford. Women who needed somewhere safe to stay. Women who needed someone to believe them when powerful men called them liars. She called it the Second Voice Foundation because every woman deserved to speak, even when the world tried to silence her. 6 months after the trial, Claire returned to the Morrison Gallery, not as curator, as owner. She'd bought it with part of her settlement. The board had resigned in shame after their treatment of her, and Claire had no intention of bringing them back. Her first exhibition featured women artists who'd been overlooked or dismissed, women whose work deserved to be seen. The opening was packed, but this time people came for the art, not the drama. Natalie found her standing in front of a particularly striking painting, Hope on her hip. "You did it," Natalie said softly. "You actually did it." "We did it," Claire corrected. "I couldn't have survived without you. You were always going to survive. You're the strongest person I know." Claire looked around the gallery, at the art on the walls and the people admiring it, at her daughter babbling happily in her arms. "I don't feel strong, I feel tired." Those aren't mutually exclusive. That night, after everyone left and the gallery was quiet, Claire stood alone in the space she now owned. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. For a moment at Amen, she considered ignoring it. Unknown numbers never brought good news. But curiosity won. She opened the message. It was from Michael, sent from prison. Somehow. "I'm sorry, man, for everything. I hope you can forgive me someday." Claire read it twice. Then she deleted it without responding. Forgiveness wasn't something she owed him. Forgiveness was something she was learning to give herself. For staying too long, for ignoring the warning signs, for believing his lies. She pulled up her contacts and scrolled to Thomas's number. They'd become unlikely friends, bonded by their mutual desire to stop Michael. She typed quickly, "Thank you for everything. You saved my life." His response came a minute later. "You saved your own life. I just gave you the tools." Claire smiled and locked her phone. Hope was asleep in her carrier, tiny fists curled against her chest. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, the same city where her life had fallen apart and somehow rebuilt itself. She thought about the woman who'd walked into that restaurant 7 months ago, pregnant and desperate and breaking. She thought about flipping that table, about the video going viral, about how everyone had watched her humiliation play out in real time. That moment had felt like the end, like the lowest point she'd ever reach. She understood now that it had been the beginning of learning who she really was, the beginning of understanding that survival wasn't the same as living, the beginning of fighting back even when fighting back seemed impossible. Claire locked the gallery door and walked out into the night, her daughter against her heart, and felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. She felt like herself. 1 year after the trial, Claire stood at the front of a community center on Chicago's South Side. The room was full of women, all of them at different stages of leaving difficult situations. Some had black eyes they'd tried to cover with makeup. Some clutched restraining orders. Some just looked exhausted in the way that comes from years of fighting. This was the 10th monthly meeting of the Second Voice Foundation's support group. Claire had started it as a way to give back, but somewhere along the way it had become something more. These women kept her grounded, reminded her why the fight mattered. "Thank you all for coming," Claire began. "I know it's not easy to be here, to admit you need help, to face what you're going through." She paused, looking around the room. "A year ago, I was living in a $40 motel room, 8 months pregnant, with $1,500 to my name. My husband had destroyed my career, my reputation, and my sense of self. I called a suicide hotline because I couldn't see a way forward." Several women nodded. They understood. I'm not going to tell you it gets easier, Claire continued. It doesn't, not for a long time. But it gets better, not perfect, not simple, just better. And sometimes better is enough. After the meeting, a young woman approached her. She couldn't have been more than 25, with a baby on her hip and a bruise fading on her cheek. Mrs. Hartley, I just wanted to say thank you. Your story gave me the courage to leave. I'm staying at one of your foundation's safe houses now. Claire took the woman's hand. What's your name? Jennifer. Jennifer Brooks. This is my daughter, Emma. Hi, Emma, Claire said softly to the baby, who grabbed her finger. How old? 6 months. He's never even held her. Jennifer's voice broke. His own daughter, and he's never held her because he says she cries too much. Claire understood. She pulled out a business card. This is Grace Winters. She's a lawyer who works with the foundation. Call her tomorrow. She'll help you file for custody and get a restraining order to no charge. Jennifer stared at the card like it was something precious. I can't afford a lawyer. You don't have to. That's what the foundation is for. We fight for women who can't fight alone. After Jennifer left, Claire found Natalie waiting by the door. They'd fallen into a routine of getting coffee after these meetings, decompressing from the heavy emotions that always filled the room. You're good at this, Natalie said as they walked to a nearby cafe. At what? Helping people. You found your purpose. Claire considered that. I found a purpose. I'm not sure it's my only one. Inside the cafe, they ordered drinks and claimed a table by the window. Hope, now a year old, sat in a high chair between them, contentedly destroying a banana. So, Natalie said carefully, are you ever going to date again? Claire laughed. That's subtle. I'm serious. You're young, you're single, you're a millionaire. Men would line up. The wrong men would line up. Men who want my money or my story or their 15 minutes of fame attached to mine. Not all men are like Michael. I know that. But right now, I'm happy alone. Claire wiped banana off Hope's face. I have my daughter. I have the gallery. I have the foundation. That's enough. Natalie studied her. Is it though, really? Claire thought about it honestly. Was she happy she was content? She was fulfilled. But happy felt like a word for people who hadn't been through what she'd been through. I'm working on it, she said finally. Later that night, Claire sat in the nursery of her brownstone in Lincoln Park. She'd sold the penthouse immediately after the divorce. Too many bad memories. This place was smaller but warmer. A home, not a showcase. Hope slept in her crib, one small hand clutching a stuffed elephant. Claire watched her breathe and felt the familiar mix of love and terror that came with motherhood. This tiny person depended on her completely. There was no room for breaking down, no room for giving up. Her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. Thinking of you today. 1 year since the verdict. How are you holding up? Claire smiled. Thomas had become an unexpected constant in her life. Not a replacement father. She had one of those who she'd mostly forgiven. But a mentor. A friend, someone who understood what Michael had been and what he'd become. I'm good. Really good, actually. Hope is perfect. The foundation is growing. Life is manageable. Manageable is progress. Proud of you, Claire. She set her phone aside and pulled out the journal her therapist had recommended. She'd been skeptical at first, but writing had become meditative, a way to process everything that had happened. Today's entry was short. 1 year ago, Michael was sentenced. I thought I'd feel victorious. Instead, I felt empty, like winning still meant I'd lost years of my life to someone who never deserved them. Now I realize that's okay. I did lose those years, but I gained something too. I gained myself, the real version. Not the one who tried to be perfect for someone else, not the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace. I gained the woman who flipped a table, who fought back, who survived. And that woman, she's not afraid anymore. Claire closed the journal and looked around the nursery. At the walls, she'd painted herself in soft yellow. At the books lining the shelves, at the framed photo of her and Hope at the garnery opening. This was her life now, built from the rubble of her old one. Different, smaller in some ways, infinitely bigger in others. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, broken and desperate and certain she'd never recover. If she could send that woman a message, what would she say? Hold on. It gets better. Not perfect, not easy, but better. And sometimes, better is exactly enough. 18 months after the trial, Claire received a letter, not an email or a text, an actual physical letter delivered to the gallery by courier. The return address was federal prison. The name was Michael Hartley. Claire stared at it for a long time before opening it. Grace had advised her years ago to save any communication from Michael, in case he tried anything. But he'd been silent since the trial. No messages, no attempts at contact, nothing. Until now. She opened the envelope carefully, as if it might contain something dangerous. In a way, it did. The letter was handwritten on lined paper. Claire, I've been in therapy. Court mandated at first, but I kept going because I needed to understand what I became. Why I hurt you. Why I destroyed everything good in my life. The therapist says I have narcissistic personality disorder. That helps explain it, but it doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses what I did to you. I know you probably never want to hear from me again, but I'm writing because our daughter deserves better than the man I was. And if there's any chance you'd let me try to be that better man, even from prison, I want to take it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I'm just asking for the chance to know hope, even if it's through letters, even if it's just photos. I understand if you say no. I understand if you throw this letter away and never respond, but I had to try. Michael. Claire read it 3 times. Each time, she felt different emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, a tiny treacherous part of her that wanted to believe people could change. She called Thomas that night. Michael wrote to me. What did he say? She read him the letter. When she finished, there was a long silence. What do you think? She asked. I think my son is very good at saying what people want to hear. He always has been. But what if he's genuine? What if therapy actually helped? Then he'll prove it through actions, not words. Claire, you don't owe him anything, not even the benefit of the doubt. But the letter bothered her, not because she wanted Michael back in her life. That door was permanently closed. But because Hope deserved to know her father, even if that father was deeply flawed. She discussed it with her own therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Bennett, who'd helped Claire process everything that had happened. What does your gut tell you, Dr. Bennett asked. My gut tells me to protect Hope, to keep her away from him. And your heart. Claire thought about that. My heart says everyone deserves a second chance. But my heart has been wrong before. They worked through it over several sessions. Eventually, Claire made a decision. She would respond to Michael, but with clear boundaries. He could write to Hope. She would save the letters until Hope was old enough to decide if she wanted to read them. He could receive photos, but not regularly. And there would be no visits until Hope was old enough to choose for herself. She wrote back with those terms. Michael agreed immediately. Over the next few months, letters arrived sporadically. Always appropriate, always focused on Hope. Michael wrote about his childhood, about his parents, about mistakes he'd made. He sent drawings he'd done in art therapy. He wrote Hope stories about a little girl who was brave and kind. Claire read every letter before filing it away. Some part of her was waiting for the manipulation to show through, for the real Michael to emerge. But it never did. If he was pretending, he was doing it perfectly. She didn't know what that meant. If a monster learned to act human, did that make them human? Or just a better actor? The gallery was thriving. Claire had expanded to represent 50 artists, all of them women or non-binary creators who'd struggled to break into the traditional art world. Her reputation had shifted from woman who flipped a table to curator who amplifies marginalized voices. The foundation had grown too. 3 safe houses now, a legal clinic, a job placement program. Every month, Claire met women who told her the foundation had saved their lives. It should have felt like victory. And it did. Mostly. But sometimes. Late at night when Hope was asleep and the brownstone was quiet, Claire felt the weight of everything that had happened. The lost years, the trauma, the way her body still tensed when men raised their voices, the nightmares where she was back in that motel room with $1,500 and no future. You have PTSD, Dr. Bennett told her matter-of-factly. That's normal after what you experienced. It's not a weakness, it's a wound that needs treatment. So Claire did the work. She went to therapy weekly. She practiced meditation. She built a life that felt stable and safe. She dated occasionally, though never seriously. She focused on being the kind of mother she wanted Hope to have. And slowly, incrementally, she healed. On Hope's second birthday, they had a small party in the gallery. Just close friends. Thomas, some of the women from the foundation. Hope wore a purple dress and had frosting in her hair within minutes. She was walking now, talking in short sentences, developing a personality that was entirely her own. Fierce, independent, curious. Nothing like Michael, nothing like Claire either. Just Hope. Thomas pulled Claire aside during the party. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not just for surviving, for thriving. I'm not sure I'd call it thriving. I'm still figuring things out." "We're all still figuring things out. That's called living." He smiled. "Michael wrote to me too. Did you know that?" Claire shook her head. "He's different. I don't know if it's permanent, but he's trying." Thomas looked across the room at Hope, who was being held by Natalie. "Maybe someday, when she's ready, she can decide what relationship she wants with him." "Maybe," Claire agreed, "but not today." Today was about celebration, about a little girl who didn't know yet what her parents had been through, who just knew she was loved and safe and surrounded by people who'd moved mountains for her. That night, after everyone left and Hope was asleep, Claire stood in the gallery alone. She'd installed a new piece that week, a mirror sculpture by an artist from Detroit. When you looked into it, your reflection fractured into dozens of pieces, then slowly reassembled. Claire stared at her own fragmented face and thought about the question Natalie had asked months ago. Was she happy? Maybe not happy. Not in the uncomplicated way she'd been happy at 20, before she knew how dark the world could be. But she was whole. She was herself. She was free. And for now, that was enough. 5 years after the restaurant confrontation, Claire walked into Bloom and Barrel for the first time since that night. She'd been invited to speak at a fundraiser for domestic violence prevention, and the organizers had chosen this venue specifically. They'd asked if she'd be comfortable. She'd said yes without really thinking about it. Now, standing in the elevator as it climbed to the top floor, she felt her heart racing. Hope, now 5 years old, held her hand and chattered about something from school. Claire barely heard her. The doors opened. The restaurant looked exactly the same. Chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline glittering beyond the glass. For a moment, Claire was frozen. "Mama." Hope tugged her hand. "Are we going in?" "Yes," Claire said. "Alle, we're going in, man." The fundraiser was well attended. Politicians, business leaders, representatives from nonprofits. Claire was introduced as the keynote speaker, and when she walked to the podium, she saw it. The corner table. The same with Ninon. Someone had placed a small brass plaque on it, in memory of every woman who found her voice in this space. Claire felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. She'd learned to cry less and speak more. That's what tonight was about. 5 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady. "I walked into this restaurant and confronted my husband about his affair. I poured water on his mistress's head. I flipped this table." She gestured to the corner. That moment was captured on video and went viral. For weeks, I was either a hero or a cautionary tale, depending on who you asked. The room was silent except for the soft clink of glasses. I'm not here to rehash that story. You all know it. I'm here to talk about what happened after. Because the viral moment is just the beginning. The real fight comes later. When the cameras are gone and you're alone and you have to decide if you're going to survive. She spoke for 20 minutes about the systematic destruction she'd faced, about the motel room and the suicide hotline, about Thomas and Grace and all the people who'd helped her fight back, about the foundation and the hundreds of women they'd helped since then. "Recovery isn't linear," she said. "I still have bad days. Days when I question everything. Days when I'm angry at myself for staying as long as I did. But I also have good days. Days when I look at my daughter and know I made the right choice. Days when I help another woman escape and know this work matters." She paused, looking around the room. "If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're not the problem. And you deserve better than someone who makes you question your own reality." The applause was thunderous. People stood. Claire saw several women crying. After the speech, They lined up to talk to her, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. One woman in particular stood out. She was young, maybe late 20s, with nervous eyes and a wedding ring she kept twisting. "I think my husband is cheating," she whispered, "but I don't have proof, and everyone says I'm paranoid." Claire took her hands. "Trust your instincts. They're usually right. Here's my card. Call the foundation tomorrow. We'll help you." The woman clutched the card like a lifeline. "Thank you." After the event, Claire stood at the corner table alone. The plaque gleamed in the candlelight. She ran her fingers over it, remembering. That was beautiful. A man's voice behind her. Claire turned. He was maybe 40, with kind eyes and an easy smile. "Thank you. I'm James. James Fletcher. I work with one of the nonprofits here tonight. Your story is remarkable." They talked for a few minutes. He was a therapist who worked with trauma survivors. He'd lost his sister to domestic violence 10 years earlier. The foundation he'd started in her memory had helped hundreds of people. "We should collaborate," he said. "Our organizations could do a lot of good together." Claire found herself smiling. "I'd like that." They exchanged information. As he walked away, Natalie appeared at her elbow. Was that flirting? That was networking. It was flirting, and you smiled, actually smiled. Claire laughed. "Stop." But Natalie was right. She had smiled, and it had felt natural, easy. For the first time in years, Claire felt open to the possibility of letting someone in. Not now, not yet, but someday. Later that night, Claire tucked Hope into bed in their brownstone. Hope's room was painted light green now, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. She'd decorated it herself, choosing colors and posters and a reading nook by the window. "Mama," Hope said sleepily, "why were those women crying tonight?" "Because sometimes people need to hear that they're not alone." "Were you alone?" Claire thought about that question. "Yes, for a while, but then I found people who helped me, and now I help other people. That's what we do when we've been through hard things. We reach back and pull others forward. Like a chain. Exactly like a chain." Hope's eyes drifted closed. Claire stayed until her breathing evened out, then crept from the room. In her own bedroom, she found herself looking at old photos on her phone. Not the ones from her marriage. She'd deleted most of those. But the ones from after. From the first gallery opening. From Hope's birth. From foundation events. She looked different in those photos. Older, yes, but also more real. The polished veneer she'd worn during her marriage was gone. What remained was a woman with lines around her eyes and gray threading through her dark hair, and a smile that came from actual joy, not performance. She pulled up the video, the original one from 5 years ago. She hadn't watched it in years, couldn't bear to see herself that vulnerable, that desperate. But tonight she felt strong enough. She watched herself walk into the restaurant, watched herself sit down at the table, watched the confrontation unfold, watched herself flip that table and walk away. The woman in the video looked terrified under her calm exterior, shaking, breaking. Claire wanted to reach through the screen and tell her it would be okay, that she'd survive, that 5 years later, she'd be happy. The video ended. Claire closed it and opened her journal instead. 5 years ago tonight, my life fell apart in the most public way possible. I thought I'd never recover. I thought I'd always be the pregnant woman who lost control in a restaurant. But that's not who I am anymore. I'm the woman who fought back, who built something meaningful from the wreckage, who learned that survival isn't the same as living, but both are necessary. I'm the woman who took the worst moment of her life and turned it into purpose. I'm the woman my daughter will be proud to call mother. I'm the woman I should have been all along. And that woman, she's not afraid of anything anymore, because she's already survived the worst. Everything else is just details. Claire closed the journal and turned off the light. Through the window, Chicago glittered in the darkness, the same city where she'd been destroyed and rebuilt. Somewhere in a federal prison. Michael was probably asleep, with years left on his sentence. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Brooke was rebuilding her own life. A single mother who'd learned the same lessons Claire had. But Claire wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about tomorrow. About the woman she'd meet with from the foundation who needed legal help. About the new exhibition she was planning at the gallery. about maybe, possibly, eventually calling James Fletcher and seeing if that smile meant what she thought it meant. She was thinking about all the tomorrows she'd almost lost and how grateful she was to have them. The story of Claire Hartley wasn't about the restaurant. It wasn't about the viral video or the trial or the revenge. Those were just chapters. The real story was about a woman who'd been systematically destroyed and chose to rebuild herself anyway, who'd lost everything and discovered she'd never needed most of it, who'd been silent for so long that when she finally spoke, the world had to listen. The real story was about finding your voice when someone tries to take it, about standing up even when standing up costs everything, about teaching your daughter that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time.